where lust for a whole life and nothing but less makes people jump out of a comfortable pond into an unknown ocean. Welcome to that journey between the East and the West. Who says Rolling Stones don't gather moss? Hello, everyone. I am Meenu Gupta, your host for the day, and I'm delighted to have you join me every week as amazing people share their incredible and inspiring life stories of straddling continents. Thank you. So, my guest for today calls herself a global nomad. As the daughter of a former US diplomat, she has lived in 10 countries and visited 30 more. In technical and cultural parlance, she's a third culture kid or individual. Now, keeping her life in mind, it does not take much brain work to understand why the topic of third culture kids is central to her personal and professional life. Now, for the uninitiated, what does the term TCK or third culture kid actually mean? According to Wikipedia, I'm sure Morgan will later change it. Wikipedia describes third culture kid or third culture individuals as people who are raised in a culture other than their parents or the culture of their country of nationality and also live in a different environment or multiple different environments during a significant part of their child development years. They are typically exposed to a greater volume and variety of cultural influences than those who grow up in one cultural setting. This term applies to both adults and children. Now, in my view, in times to come, the world will see more and more of third culture and multicultural individuals, given the mobility of the age we live in and the dissolving of physical borders. Without much ado, here's my guest, Megan Norton, who's also the author of a book titled Belonging Beyond Borders and another one titled Finding Peace Under One Roof. A woman with many hats, she's also a podcast host, intercultural trainer, consultant, speaker, more and more and more. I believe Megan also co-founded, I think it's a non-profit organization for third culture individuals. Thank you, Megan, for joining us today. And do correct me wherever I was wrong. And thank you once again.
It's a pleasure to meet you. It's a pleasure to be on your platform. Thank you for hosting this to bring more awareness and understanding about the globally mobile experience.
Okay, so Megan, I will ask a question which I often pose to my guests. I just read out a few of the labels. Now, who are you as a person beyond these worldly labels?
I love that question because sometimes we do look at our external identity markers as who we are. We're looking at what does society say we are just based on labels or based on our profession. So beyond the third culture kid experience, the adult TCK experience, I find myself as an artist, as a writer. If I think about relational identity, I'm a sister, I'm a daughter, I am a soon-to-be wife. And so looking at all of that complexity, it's hard to summarize or say, who am I? It takes anybody a while to tell the complexity of their story. But I love this question because it's getting into who are you beyond what people read about you or see about you or assume about you.
Yeah, I mean, that is what people, the labels that they give. And you just said you identify with the roles of, I think you mentioned daughter, sister, and soon to be wife. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, absolutely.
And what was it like to grow up in multiple countries? Did you miss a point of reference when you were moving to different places? I'm assuming, of course, you must have gone to different schools in different countries. And from what I read, you've been to really vastly different countries. So do share this part of the journey because that is from where everything began.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. It takes a while to tell the complexity of a story. My childhood journey was very globally diverse, including countries, South Africa, South Korea, Germany, Japan, and Israel. So by the time I was 18, I had lived in 6 countries, including my passport or national country, the US. I went to international schools in all of those countries. And so when you talk about a point of reference, I often say that international schools were a consistent hub or a consistent community I always looked forward to being a part of, where the global, or the society culture around me was always different. I always found a sense of belonging in an international school. There were many international students there. We all had similar high mobile backgrounds. And I found that that was a secure and safe place. I didn't realize that going back to my passport country as an 18-year-old for university, I would have such culture shock and identity complexity crises, multiple, about who am I, where do I belong, how do I tell my story, because that international school experience was always a wonderful place for people to process, for peers to connect. We all had that similar high mobile background. But I think in the end, what could have been helpful was additional preparation for university, additional preparation for how to frame my story in a context that didn't have a lot of people who had highly mobile backgrounds. I also find that my particular high mobile background, being part of the U.S. Foreign Service sector, there was that predictability of we were going to move every 3 years or every 2 years. And that became a regular pattern in childhood of knowing, okay, I know that this is going to be home for this set period of time. And I think other TCKs or TCKs in other sectors might have different experiences of that security of knowing, how long am I going to be in this place? How long can I attach myself to this place? And so I really appreciated looking back and processing through that pattern of mobility, that it was predictable and that we always had a place in the US to return to, which namely was my grandparents' house. And that added a lot of grounding, I think, for me to have attachment to my passport country.
So US is your passport country. When you say passport country, you're saying this is where you were born.
Yes. Well, yes, I was born in the US, but I also find that TCKs, when they say passport country, it's where their, nationality is or their citizenship, not necessarily where they were born. But for me personally, yes, I was born in the US. And so I frame it as a passport country and not necessarily home country, because home is such a complex and very charged word, I think, for TCKs. And so I make the distinction very specifically to say passport country because I don't want to use home country.
I totally understand. And I'm glad you did that because where you were born could be different from your passport country. And passport, I have come to now to that conclusion. Passport is better left as a booklet, which is a piece of paper or pieces of paper which make it easier for you to cross borders legally. That's it. That is the significance. Otherwise, when one attaches too much emotional significance to a piece of paper, it can go in depth to identity crisis. So I'm glad you used the word passport country as vis-a-vis born country, and you, as you rightly said, the word home. Home word very nicely put is a very charged word for many people, not only for third culture individuals. I would put that. My question to you is, I'm glad you mentioned about the fact that you knew there was a definite pattern. So you knew every 2 or 3 years, all of you would be moving to another country. So there was a temporariness to everything that you had. It could be home, relationships, experiences. Now, having said that, now I want you to separate that for a moment. Keep that one image in your mind, which I'm sure you will. You've lived it through. Now you're in the US, right? Since a while, since how many years?
It's been 5 years.
Okay. So which is a tad longer than and the idea would also be a bit now different because the word temporary is not mentally attached to that experience. How does it shape your life? See, life is, as we would put it spiritually, is a temporal journey. For people who believe in reincarnation, is we are spiritual beings having an earthly existence. At some point, we're going to die and move on, and that will be another part. So it is temporal. Our whole existence is temporal. We just forget that we're going to die. We don't know when. It could be today, tomorrow, or like 30 years later. So having said that, the word temporary for you was like pretty much embedded in the, life then. So can you share how that was and how this is?
I think it's an ongoing journey of negotiation. What does it mean to be temporary? What is my relationship to how I approach place? How do I approach relationships? It's ongoing, these micro decisions of leaning in to connect, of choosing to connect. There was a time in my early adulthood where I thought I had to keep moving, that was a part of my innate identity, that I would be losing or even maybe not appreciating my TCK experience if I didn't keep moving. And that was a faulty narrative, a faulty message I had internalized of saying, I must keep moving because I'm a TCK. Yes, TCKs can have this sense of rootlessness and restlessness, but I've come to realize that that doesn't need to control your decision making. I think it's also detrimental if it does, because you're equating then your entire life and decisions on temporal decisions. I often think, for me, when I was in young adulthood, there was this ticking time in my brain, like 3 years, okay, I must move. And that came from that pattern of keeping to move. And I think that it was compounded by, a 4-year university degree and then a master's degree. So after higher education, it was this negotiation of, okay, where do I belong? Where do I want to create connection? Do I miss high mobility? Yes. I do look at people who have jobs that take them, to a new country every 2 years or have that kind of career. But in the end, I need to do what's best for who I am and who I want to become. And with that, it's a trade-off of decisions. It's a trade-off of, okay, I'm not going to lean into that ticking time of ding, it's time to go, but I can make other micro decisions of maybe changing something about my routine or changing my hair color or changing how the furniture is in the house to satiate that need for change. And so I kind of wish I had learned that a little bit earlier in life, in my young adulthood and career, because I think I could have had more peace about staying in a certain location. But in the end, I say all this and I'm moving to another state this year and changing everything. And that's exciting. That's exciting to me, about changing environments and learning a new way of life in another state.
So now that puts another thought. I want you to rewind before I say that thought. Okay, before you were a young adult, you were a child. And when you were a child, you knew that my father's going to go, so we will all be going to another place, and my school is going to change. Now, when you knew all that, how was it like building friendships? Did they last? Or you knew that, oh, these experiences will go away in any case. I really don't need to struggle to even study so much, because in any case, I'm going to another school like after a year or 2 years. So I want you to go back, rewind to that part of your life. What was it like as a child?
As a child, I always looked forward to another move. Yes, it was so difficult to say goodbye to friends, and certain schools, certain local communities. It was this terrible sadness, right? Terrible grief of saying goodbye, because I connected so much with friendships and, with community members. And I made an effort to stay connected, via handwriting letters and things. That was before social media. And I am often envious of TCKs nowadays who can be connected through Snapchat or Instagram. But even with that, I've heard stories of how seeing friends move on, seeing friends, participating in activities that they would have been a part of if they had still been in that country, that's contributing and compounding their own grief of having left. So it's a two-edged sword. So I moved 3 times in my teenage years, and a couple of those times it was so difficult. And I think that was attributed a bit to the developmental stage of the teenage body changing and hormones and even the brain changing. So it wasn't necessarily the move itself that was hard, but it was the developmental changes in myself. And what I found helpful, I think, was being able to connect on the common ground that we're all globally mobile. We're all outside of our home country, right? Or where our passport says we're from. And so that was a really bonding thing in all the international schools. I also understand that international schools are doing a better job with having good goodbyes with their students. I think that's brilliant, because TCKs and globally mobile peers, they need to be able to have closure to friendships. They need to be able to affirm and have goodbye parties, to be able to have that space and that stance to be able to welcome new friends in their life in the new school. Safe Passage Across Networks is a community and organization that does a lot of transition care and programs, which I'm really impressed by. I really wish I had had that kind of structure in my schools, because I think it would have opened up more of that freedom to express emotions and to say, this is important to acknowledge and to work through in order to have the capacity to welcome new friendships when in your new destination.
Interesting. That's that different. That's the reason I wanted to go down that route, because that's where all the experiences start adding up and the conclusions. Because at that time, the young brain is thinking and arriving and striving to make sense of their own world and the world around them. So, and as you rightly said, the teenage years would have been, I guess, more turmoil, because sense of one is figuring out a sense of identity and belonging and probably rootedness and groups. And as you rightly said it, even one would miss out on the experiences one would ideally have been part of if one had been there. But I guess, as you just now mentioned, the TCKs now would have probably a different time because of, again, global mobility and this entire digital space and digital mania, actually, the world of digital mania that we live in. But again, there's something else to be said for physical presence, as much as one would say, okay, I'm digitally connected to so and so, but at some point, people have to meet and be part of the same physical space.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And I love that social media, email has given us the platform to connect and to stay in touch. I think increasingly the world is getting smaller, and with travel, opportunities as they are, it's easier to bump into somebody saying, I'm going to be in London, or I might be in California these dates. I'd love to meet up. That's certainly something I love to do. Yes, it's important to say goodbye to people in that season of life, but also look forward to the day you might be able to have a reunion and reconnect.
What does the word home mean for you in particular in your journey of life?
Oh, what a question.
Yeah, it's a very big one. You can have many things of where, what, with who, or something else, or the smell, or a feeling. Because it's such a loaded word. Even I think if somebody had asked me, where is home? Probably 15, 20 years ago, I would have just, oh, that is home. And, but then it changes. It changes over time with people, with movement, and with experiences. And suddenly suddenly say one day, okay, this is what is home for me. Suddenly, when some kind of nostalgia hits you.
Absolutely. Yes. I think we need to categorize or classify what home is. In what lens are we talking about, or even what stage of life are we talking about what home is, or who is home, where is home, why is home. So a couple things I want to respond to that question with is I've lived in 10 countries, and I consider all 10 of those my heart homes. They reside in little corners of my heart, and I carry them with me. And like you said, nostalgia, it's when I meet a new person and maybe they grew up in a country in which I temporarily lived. There's that swinging back of memories and fond, you know, memories of taste and smell, like you said. There's this instant desire to connect and to share my story with that, understanding that's part of my home and one of my heart homes. Another part of how I define home is where my physical and emotional needs are met. And that's taken different forms over the years. I often think that it's where my parents live is where home is. But in this season of life, as previously mentioned, I'm getting married. And so I'm already thinking through, I'm going to be establishing a new home with my husband. What does that look like? And how do we build that together? Really big, sometimes overwhelming questions to navigate through, but I've built home before. And so that gives me a confidence and assurance I can build home again. Ultimately, it's where my physical and emotional needs are met.
That is how you would finally define home at present.
At present, yes.
Okay, lovely. And that means the word belonging is also, of course, connected to that. So, the follow up question, where do you feel that you belong now?
Yes, another huge question. Belonging, it's a tremendous topic. It's a tremendous word, and it can mean so many different things to different people in different seasons of life. So for me right now, where I have a sense of belonging is with my soon to be partner, with my immediate nuclear family, which includes my mother, my father, and my brother. And I also have a sense of belonging, weirdly enough, I think, to some of my belongings, like physical objects that mean a lot to me because they're these cultural artifacts from my childhood. They're these what some TCK consultants call transfer cues or sacred objects that hold a lot of emotional attachment to place or to people who have given it to you, or people who it brings to mind when you see it. So I think that I like to surround myself with certain objects and belongings that remind me and reflect back to me like who I am. And so it's interesting, again, in this season of packing up my belongings and ultimately going to see them in a new environment. But I think that is a consistency that brings me a lot of grounding and like understanding that, okay, this is my belonging.
Did you feel when you were, it was just a question, keeping your own life in mind, and that you also support and you work with a lot of third culture individuals? Do you feel that in families where they are hopping from one country to another, they bond more closely together because their closest point of reference is their nuclear family? Is Do you think that is so? Because logically that would make sense to me, because wherever they go, the environment is different. Generally, it happens in teenage years. People move After a certain age, their point of reference starts moving out from the immediate family to friends and other people and other groups. However, if you're constantly moving, is it true? Because logically, it would be true that your point of reference is your close family and therefore you bond more closely and, we are there forever kinds.
I would say it really depends on the family unit. I don't think there's an overarching yes or no with that question. We can't be definitive because there's so many different family unit experiences. I'm particularly thinking about families who have children maybe going to different schools and different school systems. Maybe one's going to a school in which the language of teaching is different than the home language, or maybe one child is going to an international school. Those experiences are going to be completely different for those children. So while, yes, they have the shared history of location, it could be that they're not sharing the same emotional language that or how they express their emotions. I think of one family in particular. There's 4 kids, and the mom has asked them, "Where are you from, or where do you consider home?" And each of those kids will say a different country. And in fact, a couple of them will also say what language they prefer to speak in because the home language is different than the school language or the academic language. So how do they express themselves and when do they express themselves is all very different. Moreover, if there's large or not necessarily large age gaps between siblings, some siblings will live in countries that their younger siblings may not have lived in, and vice versa. Maybe an older sibling has already graduated and gone on to higher education or gap year or work, and the younger siblings are moving to a new country. So it really depends, but I think it's important. It's so important for the parental unit to check in with their children and have that emotional normalizing of saying transition is hard, moving to a new country is both, and it's the anticipation of new and it's also the grieving of what we're leaving here. And so I advocate that parents and families normalize talking about the good, the exciting, the anticipating of what they're going to plug into, and taking that time to process all of their losses. And sometimes it's even these hidden losses, like I'm not going to graduate with my class here in this country. That's a hidden loss. And so take that time in transition to do both and.
Interesting, because that means it's very individual. It's and people are not really, as somebody wisely said, we assume that people are logically driven at times, or they should be. They're not really logically driven. A large part of the human system is not logically driven. So that sort of points to that. Now, since you had the opportunity to move to different countries, and though you were in an international school, and do correct me if I'm wrong, being in international schools is also being in a very protective oasis, is it not?
Yes, typically it's physically protective, right? There's walls, there's a gate, that an entrance security check, and also I would say emotionally protective in terms of high touch points with counselors and educators who are at the school.
But that is one part. And then outside the school, also, there is lives. You come in contact with people who are belonging to that country or wherever you are. So you are exposed to immense cultural diversity, right? You have a life outside the school. So, having said that, there are 3 lives that you have: a life at home, a life in the school with that many nationalities, I guess, from what I understand, 40, 50 nationalities under one roof. And then you have a third life where you see people or of that country where when you go to shop and so on, there'll be people largely of that country there. So what does this mean for you? This cultural diversity that you grew up with, what was that like? What did that do to you? Is the question.
Yeah, fascinating question. I love that question that you bring up because often we think about the globally mobile individual of, wow, you're going to a new country, and it's thinking about that country's culture. And the reality is what you're speaking in of there are subcultures. There are subcultures that the TCK is navigating constantly, daily, from what you exactly said, the home culture, the school culture, the national culture, and even subcultures with clubs or sports or other extracurricular activities. And so, what I find fascinating with TCKs is that there's this cultural code switching going on that they learn innately. They learn like this is normal. I'm going to act this way in this environment, and I'm going to act this way in this environment. That's a sense of privilege sometimes. That's a sense of negotiating language differences. And I think TCKs need to celebrate that and lean into that more into their adulthood. That what they learned in childhood is actually these cultural competencies that are giving them access to belong to different communities, to be able to be bridge builders in different pockets of cultures. Not everybody has learned that in childhood. And so to recognize that and to practice that as a child, I think is a celebration that TCKs need to recognize and also name in when they're doing job interviews or when they're looking for careers. To frame it as I know how to listen, observe, be curious, to even shift my body language and to approach different situations differently because that's what I did as a child. So I think this is one of the huge superpowers of TCKs that they ultimately learn in navigating different subcultures.
That's interesting. So you're saying that intercultural competence, which in my words largely means being open and, as you said, curious, listening, observing instead of judging, and sort of navigating a way, it becomes an innate ability. That is what you are saying for most TCKs or third culture individuals.
Yes, and I think it's innate because they've practiced it. But with intercultural competencies, I think you have to reflect on it and also process and practice. So it's not that they can just rest on their laurels of, yes, I am interculturally competent because I grew up overseas. No, like you have to continually process what is going on here. It's active, it's also practicing it. And that's the hesitation also of saying like all TCKs are interculturally competent. No, because you have to do the work. Sometimes coach TCKs and saying, yes, you can call in a job interview or with future employers, you can name your TCK experience and say, I'm a TCK, but you have to explain why has that been so crucial for you and how is that shaping you as a professional? How is that shaping you as a contributing human to greater society? And that takes that reflection of, wow, let me give you a specific example of in this context, I worked this way, but that wouldn't be appropriate in another context. So that's what I would say. It's innate, yes, and draw out those specific examples.
In your life, how would you give, if you give a couple of experiences as examples, that would be interesting for you as a third culture kid or when you were moving. I mean, give me a couple of examples in very different countries because I saw that you moved. US would be one, and then the other part of the globe also. So you actually moved between the East and the West, which made it very relevant for you to be present today. You are bridging physically those borders. So now your experience of handling what you did in the West, in how you did it differently in the East, or let's say somewhere in the Eastern country. Just give me a couple of, because that would bring relevance to the point.
Absolutely. Yes. As an adult TCK, I've lived in four more countries. So Greece, Hungary, Poland, and Austria, all Central Western Europe. One of the things in Hungary that comes to mind is I lived in a very quite, I would say, quote unquote, remote town. It took at least an hour to get to one of the bigger cities. And what took me there was to teach English at a local kind of charter school in a Hungarian town. And some of the fellow, teachers there, Hungarian teachers, they actually were betting how long I would stay because they thought, wow, here's this person who's lived in cosmopolitan cities. How long is she going to last in this town? But ultimately, the people who had faith in me won the bet because I did, make the decision to move there because I wanted that experience and invest skills that I had into that community. But moreover, the community in my fellow teachers were saying that I had the skills of adapting. I had done the adapting before. And so being open minded, being there with the mindset that things are going to be different, things are going to not be perhaps as accessible as in a major city. I knew that. And that's something that I didn't go there thinking of like, oh, it's going to be so, remote, but it's because it was that pattern, that innate pattern of the TCK. I'm going to go there for and observe and adapt to that environment. Another example that comes to mind is a recent one where I actually went to this this environment that I consider very US American, where people are loud, where people are very expressive. And I felt really out of place. And I was talking to one of my South Korean friends about this. And I said, I just was not just connecting to that environment because they were, in my opinion, just being obnoxious. And she made the comment, well, that's where your Asian side comes out, where you're not going to be as expressive as US Americans. And I really loved her comment because I thought, yes, that's so true. That my experience growing up, perhaps in Asian contexts where it's not as culturally common to be as, I would say, quote unquote, US American obnoxious. I was like, okay, I feel justified and affirmed and validated in that. So it's just a funny story. It's not anything really significant related to career, but I did like hearing that had shaped how I like to spend my time and gave me some insight into how or when to not go to certain events.
Yeah, that's actually very significant and very interesting, I find, because it shows the development of a person, development points of a person, and from where the source of development came. So, just which Asian countries did you spend some years?
I lived 3 years in South Korea and 3 years in Japan.
And that is so different. Both the countries are so different from where you are today and your passport country, so to say. So, in culture, now we come to a very big word, culture. So, today we are talking about very big or heavy words.
Yes.
So, in culture, that's because that is such a big word. There's a national culture, there's a community culture. I always say there's a company culture, family culture. And though people say, no, we talk about personality, I say there's an individual culture as well. Because then you are the person who take from all these cultures and become that one culture. So I define as a separate individual culture as well. Having said that, right now, as Megan Norton, who's sitting in front of me, you would have a little bit of all those cultures as well, I gather, because from the example that you just gave, which is very insightful, which part of you has come let's say from, as an example, from Korea and South Korea and Japan, which is now part of you as a human being?
Wow. These are very probing self reflection questions. Thank you, Meenu. I enjoy these discussions because it gives opportunity to kind of look inside, even the head and the heart journey of who am I? I like the image that I've heard before with TCK consultants. There are actually two images. One is of a fan that opens and closes. And the idea of this analogy is that we all have these fans that represent different parts of our formative years, of what was part of our culture in our formative years, and that fan will expand, if the opportunity arises. So I think about the fan opening with my Japan experience and South Korea experiences, when I want to, approach leadership maybe in a way where I'm not going to vocalize my opinion in a setting. That's something that comes to mind immediately when I'm thinking about how those environments and context shaped who I am. The other image that I've heard TCK consultants use is a pie that you bake or eat, and there are different slices that represent who you are. And so that will, again, you'll be in a certain slice, if in a certain context. The way that I framed it in my book is with an image called the identity orbit. And essentially, if you think about an orbit, the rings around the nuclear part are always in movement. What I invite people to do when they're doing this exercise is, on those orbit rings, identify parts of your experience that have shaped who you are. So it could be classmates, it could be cities you've lived in, it could be foods, it could be music, it could be absolutely anything. And the idea is that those things on your orbits may not be close to your nuclear identity, your core identity at the time. But if a situation arises where you are able to go to a restaurant that has one of your favorite past comfort foods that's on that orbit, that will come closer to your core identity, and it'll bring up again those memories of smell, taste, people, community, traditions. So the idea is that belonging and home and your identity might be forgotten, but it's never lost. It's never lost. We carry all of those experiences within us, and there just needs to be this little trigger or glimmer or experience that brings it right back around, that you have a sense of gratitude of, wow, I've forgotten about that, but I appreciate that's part of who I am.
It's interesting, actually. And how would you then define culture and diversity? Because like I said, I think of culture very differently. Once upon a time, national culture was taken as culture. Now that time has now long gone, or is receding. We are in a different part of, I think, 10 years later, when people look back, the national culture thing will not even exist. It is becoming such a symphony of music between the East and the West and the global South. I correct myself nowadays, between the East and the West also includes the global South and the North. And so for you, with your keeping your life and background as a lived in experience, how would you define these two words as a lived in experience, coming from the way you have lived, culture and diversity?
Wow, you are not letting up for these big words. These are, I love it.
Because they mean so many different things to different people, and I try and focus on the lived experience, because what is in the book could be just belonging to that book and that particular person who wrote it. It may actually, and this time and age, may not be actually that relevant to the person who's reading it. Therefore, I'm focusing on what it means for you, it could be really different from what it means to somebody else and maybe have even more relevance to 1,000 more people.
Yes, accurate. Culture, where I'm defining it from, is a place of what is learned and practiced. When I think about third culture kids, that culture piece, there's those working assumptions that if you call yourself a third culture kid, there's that working assumption that you have had some sort of high mobility, cross-cultural experiences in your childhood. So the bonding part of third culture kids is that cultural piece of I have had to navigate not feeling belonging here or feeling belonging here, feeling both and, feeling neither nor. And so where that relates, I think, to diversity is when I think of the word diversity, I'm coming from a place of thinking through identity markers. What are those traditional external identity markers that people see? What boxes do we check on different forms? But we can also think about diversity as those hidden identity markers, those hidden cultural experiences. And that's where I think there's that intersection between TCKs and diversity, is that there's this even conflation of we have external and internal diversity that, yes, some of course are visible, but what are those invisible things? What are those diverse things that you can't see, that you can't assume about me because of just how I look externally? It's interesting, here in the US, there's DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, in HR, in companies, in higher education. DEI, it's a term, right, an acronym that is used to highlight and heighten awareness of how can we recognize, appreciate, celebrate, lean in to what and who is in our community. It's interesting, now they're adding the letter B to this acronym. So it's DEIB, belonging is the B. So yes, to a certain point, the culture of a company, the culture of a higher ed institution can say, yes, we celebrate and we have the DEI standards. And that's only a solution to a certain point. We need to include belonging. And how do we make people feel that they belong? How do we create opportunities for people to contribute to belonging? Because ultimately, a culture needs to have those patterns of doing, those patterns of being, but also, is there room for difference in cultural patterns? And how is that being invited? How are people being invited to shift the culture with their own diversity?
So then it now comes to now two more questions now coming from there. Thank you for sharing about that DI and the B is now added to it, which is so important. Actually, it comes right at the beginning. How, in your opinion, does one, in a global context, give an individual a sense of belonging, whether it be in a group or in a company?
I think fundamentally, we can't rush belonging. We can't, I say in the book, you can't microwave a sense of belonging. Sometimes I think in high, fast paced, busy societies, we want everything to be instantaneous. We want results. We want to see the impact of our work. So when it comes to belonging, I think sometimes we have that same mindset and approach of, well, I tried it and it didn't work, so I don't belong. But if we think about belonging as a process, as an ongoing forming stance that we have to approach with effort, that we have to approach with expectation, with curiosity, it's going to take time. What that means in different contexts, it's certainly going to look different. But I think for individuals, knowing that belonging, it's a personal effort, that belonging doesn't happen to us, that we actually have to take initiative to investigate where can I plug in, who are safe people, how can I be an ally. I think that's a mindset shift and a cultural shift sometimes we have to take of belonging isn't going to be handed to us. We have to put in the work and the effort to belong.
That's interesting because while you were saying that, an immediate equivalent picture came to my mind of mobile chargers. It's actually very relevant because every charger would not fit in the same. So, actually, you need to know when we go back to that image, we need to know where, with whom, and to what context or place, person, object, or just space, where is my sense of belonging coming from? So it would be different, and we need to plug in there, which could be different for another person. So two people may have very different plug-in. So I like the image of the plug-in points. What would be your word of wisdom, or words of wisdom, or inspiration, or a byline to third culture individuals, not just children, who are, or I would say, third culture individuals and would be third culture people who are navigating that space?
Navigating the space of belonging, or which space?
The entire space of third culture individuals is completely rich with these words of culture, diversity, identity, belonging, all of it. So they are all constantly navigating that space. So, what would be your line of thought or word of wisdom, line of wisdom or inspiration you would like to leave it out as a thought for them?
It's an ongoing journey for me of understanding and unpacking how this experience has shaped who I am. I like to frame it as an experience and not as an identity. Because if we claim third culture kid as an identity, then that's something perhaps that can be taken away or misunderstood. It could be something that's no longer. But the third culture kid profile is actually describing an experience. So having that distinction, I think, provides a lot of freedom, a lot of normalizing of that I'm not the only one. I'm not the only TCK in the world, but I can find connection. I can find understanding. I can find normalizing who I am with other people who have had a similar experience. Beyond that, I would also like to highlight again, what are those strengths in having those experiences, naming those, celebrating them, investigating them, because I think when we have more awareness and naming of those strengths, we can take more intersectional approaches to problems or challenges in life. We can think more creatively, thinking outside the box, because TCKs and then the broader term cross cultural kids have these hybrid identities, these dual identities, these multicultural identities that are such gifts that need to be used and applied to our cultural and societal and global issues to make sure that we're answering those questions of how can we make the world into a more equitable and tolerant, empathetic world.
Thank you for that, because that obviously comes from a lot of experience. And I like the idea that third culture individuals need to move away from putting themselves with that label and that identity and move it to an experience, because then it makes it more fluid and they can absorb more. They can take or leave that an experience and move on and then figure out where the concept of belonging, etc. That sort of solidifies or makes more sense. Thank you so much, Megan, for joining me today. It has been lovely. And do continue on your journey. I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Meenu. Thank you for this opportunity. And again, thank you for this platform to bring more awareness about how we can understand the human experience.
Thank you for listening to the series Between the East and the West. Do subscribe to the channels mentioned on the site in case, of course, you liked what you heard. I am Meenu Gupta, the host of the series, and I'll be looking forward to your comments. We love feedback. Thank you once again. Namaste and bye-bye.